Hi, I'm Amanda Agnew.
And I'm Rob Lennox.
Today we're going to be talking to some local musicians.
Aye, with a pile of good tunes and a wee of stories for you for buy. So stay tuned.
So we're joined now by Linley Hamilton,
Hi guys.
How you doing?
musician, presenter and much more. Can you tell us how you started in music?
Okay, well, I'm old enough to not be ashamed to say my age because I'm 60 next birthday. So I've been playing officially 50 years this year. I started at primary school, but it was always a hobby. It was never meant to be a career. In fact, being a trumpet player or a brass player in Ireland, there weren't really career opportunities. I guess it was the Ulster Orchestra, which you'd be familiar with, and a few things in the south. So it was never really considered to be something that would be a career unless you were schooled in music, which I kind of wasn't. So the whole thing that I did, which has been very beneficial to my career, is I didn't start it as a career. I did civil engineering, went through school, studied all that kind of stuff, was heavily involved with sport whenever I was very young, and then kept the music as a kind of a side hobby. And then whenever I was about 22, there was this inaugural one-off All-Ireland Youth Jazz Orchestra. And I had one of these rare skills that brass players had in Ireland, just through pure luck of some opportunities I had in my teens. And that was at a really good ear. So although I could read music well, I had a really good ear and I could improvise and I could take solos in a whole stack of different genres. Now, not to a world-class standard, but to a much better standard than anybody else in Ireland because the schooling wasn't there for them. This was an external opportunity that sort of developed that. That's an aside. So I got into this All-Ireland Youth Jazz Orchestra and it only lasted for a year and a half. That this amazing guy called Bobby Lamb, originally from Cork, but head of Trinity music school in London. I used to play in the Woody Herman band, a total legend. And to cut a long story short, looking back at who was in that band, it's been more or less the top 20 jazz session players and rock and pop session players for the last 30 years. We were taught at a really high level. We combined every weekend for about 6 hours a day for about 2 years, and we went out into the world as pro players. Never saw that coming. How it happened for me was I was doing a thing, believe it or not. I was doing a flood wall in Strabane. I'm sure some people may have driven over it or walked past it or gone through on the way to Omagh or Londonderry or whatever it happens to be. But if you ever stop and look over it, you can think of this trumpet player dude who was the engineer on that. And I remember getting a phone call on one of the very, very first, well, it wasn't a mobile, but it was like a digital phone setup, whatever. I can't remember what it was, but it was this massive orange box, and I carried it around the site with me so that my boss, who was in charge of this £6 million project, whatever, could reach me, and I would plug it into different things, keep it charged, and then it would go off, and I knew it was serious. There was concrete coming or something serious I had to be across, you know. And I remember him ringing to this phone, and I answered the phone. He says, "You better get back to the office. It's an important phone call." So I thought, oh, that doesn't sound good. And I went back, and there was this thing called the Hubbard Casting Agency, and they were looking for my advice because they knew I'd been part of this jazz orchestra. Who's got a big personality with a Southern Ireland accent that could star in a film or play a musical instrument, and has a big personality that doesn't have to learn how to act but could star in a film. So I said, yeah, Phelim Gormley, and I gave them 2 or 3 other names and ways to get in touch with them, and that was it. And I went back to work, never thought about it. And about a year later, I was walking up and down the site, and a thing called the snag list. And basically, he was showing the people who owned the wall, the government or whatever, there's a couple of things needs done. We need to fix that hole and that. We need to replace that steel bar, and need to cut that grass and things like that. And I got another message that they'd called again. So I went back to the office and I said yes. And they said, listen, you've been very good to us. We never paid you. And we used a couple of the guys in the movie. We did a movie, and the movie's called The Commitments, and it's going to be released very soon. We'd like you to do this gig in New York, St. Patrick's Day Ball, and we'd like you to be part of the touring band because the guys in the band. I said, well, sure. I mean, nobody knew who the Commitments was at this stage. It was just pre the publicity. So I said, well, what's the bread and all that kind of stuff, the usual thing. And I said, okay, well, I can have a look at my birthday, St. Patrick's Day, so that might be a problem. They said, well, there's $1,000 on it and you're playing St. Patrick's Day in New York and you're doing, I said, okay, well, I can do that then. You know, you're paying the flights kind of thing. So that kind of started it off. And then I said, well, what about the UK tour? And they said, well, the UK tour, with 3 months work for that. And I said, well, geez, I'm going to have to try and get off. And they said, no, well, with 5 years work, 300 dates a year. I said, why? And they said, because the movie's going to be really big. I said, well, then, I don't know what to do. So I spoke to the boss and he said, what are you talking about? He says, leave and you can always be an engineer again. And that was it. I never was an engineer again. And that started a whole massive career where I toured for a bit. And I didn't tour that long. I toured maybe 3 or 4 months with them. And then I went into other stuff here with Van and Paul Brady and Foy Vance and a whole lot of different things. And then I focused very much on my jazz stuff, put bands together and started a recording career that started in 2001 with my first album as a leader. Cut the long story short, that became the focus then eventually, and the touring stopped. I did some stuff with Andrew Strong in early 2000s and Paul Brady, but the focus was very much me trying to make myself a jazz artist, and that meant working internationally more than nationally because it's such a small thing over here. So that was an aside to a pure accident where, because of my session career working on records, because I'm on like 150 records kind of thing, and I've about 9 of my own kind of thing. But as a result of that big career as a session player, then this other dude, Mike Nielsen, was put in charge of a master's course in Dublin, and it was for jazz musicians. So he rang everybody who he knew, Cian Boylan and me and Cormac and said, we're done this jazz course. And I said, well, I haven't got a jazz degree, so I'll not be able to do it. He said, no, you've got a degree in civil engineering. He says, you can audition for this master's course. So I said, okay. I had no idea because we didn't think we'd be good enough because we didn't know anything about academia. And we all got it. We all got firsts, and most of us were offered PhDs, different places. I did mine at Ulster, became a doctor of music and jazz, university lecturer now, and one of just like maybe 11 portfolio income streams that have developed since I gave up civil engineering, and music's been very good to me.
So I believe you're going to play it for us then. Can you tell us about this first set that you're going to play for us?
Do you know, I haven't actually a clue, but I have an ear full of material. All I know is it's going to be a jazz treatment of something. We're going to have a wee bit of a mixture of material that we're going to be doing, piano and trumpet. It's going to be melodic, and the improvisations are going to be melodic, not technical. The intent will be for me to be as dynamically and emotionally maximum in the music as I can be, no matter what style the piece will be.
Love that. Fantastic.
Do you find that the opportunities here in Northern Ireland are a wee bit limited, and that was kind of a stroke of luck that you had, or?
I think for me, being a jazz musician, it's lucky because your audience is small in the flesh traditionally. And so if you can make it work for 40, 50, 60 people by having merch to sell, by charging a ticket price, because obviously it's more auditorium concerts that I would do in that kind of world, then anywhere where there's a population centre of 5,000, you can make it work as long as you don't overdo it. There's a thing called Birch Jazz Bar, which is the back of the Merchant Hotel, which has been running for 14 and a half years. For those, if you've never heard of it, Birch Jazz Bar, 7 nights a week for 14 and a half years. If you haven't been there, go. A great night out. And some of us would occupy odd slots like Sunday nights, Monday nights and things like that in there, which is a safe bet to occupy. You're not really going, unless you're touring, you're not going to get any work in that night. And that's just covers stuff. And then my wife and I have this jazz venue, Maggie's Farm, MAGY''S Farm, in County Down, and that would programme a number of events. And there are Scots Jazz Club in Belfast. There are a number of opportunities, but obviously you're working outside that, UK and the south of Ireland as well, where there's quite an expansive remit.
I suppose making a career out of music here in Northern Ireland, you're taking a leap of faith, I suppose. You've been fortunate, but you're also extremely talented, so you were in a good position.
Talented is something that's overrated. I think hard work is kind of what it is. I think the way it works is music is like a language, and we always say that, but we don't delve into the deeper meaning of that. And, what we're doing now is we're auto-generating conversation. And what musicians who are either creatively composing or pre-composing are doing is they're auto-generating conversation themselves that they think is going to suit the people they're talking to. And then people like me who are auto-generating language and conversation musically while we're playing are using the same traits we are now. So a great example would be the word Brexit or the word COVID-19. Nobody had ever heard of those before 2016, but everybody just drops them in there in the coffee break, and the COVID, the old COVID, or whatever it is. And they're dropping that. Everybody knows what it means now because they've used it so many times, they've heard it so many times, they've used it as an adjective, they've used it as a noun, they've read it, they've seen it on TV. And so it becomes part of their linguistic thing. And if you're adding a technical thing in jazz, like you have to take it on, you have to watch other people doing it, you have to practice it, and then you can vertically drop it into your playing at any moment. I think that's the key to the whole thing.
So I'm very curious about your own musical influences then. What would you kind of just listen to on the daily?
Oh, well, it's changed in the last 2 or 3 years because I've had this mentality that I'm retiring and I'm moving into a different direction. So when I say retiring, not from playing, but from my academic career as a university lecturer. I'm retiring at the end of this year, so I'm 60 this year and I'll be retiring this year. And we have a venue at the farm, so my focus is that kind of thing and more international work that's relaxed where the feed structure doesn't need to be high. But primarily, truthfully, I've been listening specifically for learning. So I've been narrowing my listening down to jazz or jazz fusion options, and I've really exhausted it. I had a BBC radio show for 15 years. And so I think my expertise in that was having the rich vein of where that jazz had reached out in fusion with other players. Miles Davis was a very famous example who started with that post-electric period or electric period fusion stuff, which welcomed in rock and pop musicians into that arena. So I've been listening specifically to players who play in the stylistic way that I do. Mostly trumpet players, sometimes sax players, and sometimes singers, because they have that control over vibrato rate, over that partnership of dynamics with tension and release, which is key to jazz. And so I'm listening to learn so that I can, if I'm auto-generating the musical language by playing, and the trumpet's just a facilitator, but the music is in my heart and my head, then
right.
By listening to stuff that's really good and by understanding what their intent is whenever they play it, I should, if I'm a good enough player, in 20 seconds be able to vertically drop that into my language. So I'm listening for that. But now, I'm just hitting the window open with the car with a bit of Billy Joel and Michael McDonald and wee-ha, baby. No brass on that. Wife would say, no brass on that. I'd say, yeah, that's okay. I'm absolutely fine. Put Michael McDonald on there, yeah. Alanis Morissette, whoever it is, put it on. Come on.
I wanted to ask Linley about, you said you had a natural ear for music. Does that come from your mother or father or in particular? Or?
No, it comes from really intently listening. I remember, I'll shock you, Amanda, and a lot of people who are listening who aren't a certain vintage, but whenever I was 14 and 13 and actually really bit the bullet for the music and just got hooked on listening to it, and I remember it was people like Joe Jackson, Billy Joel. It wasn't jazz at that stage, it was Joe Jackson, Billy Joel and people like that. And I was putting the records on, and in those days, believe it or not, there was no mobile phones and no e-messages downloaded by a Martian or some other kind of thing going on. You had to sort of sit beside the record player and you had to lift the wee arm and drop it down, and you had to but it could go. You had to sort of drop that needle, and it was so hard to do, and you couldn't do it while you were shouting and watching the telly and ironing and Coronation Street's on the background. The TV was next door. It was black and white with 3 channels. The record player was in here, and you were focused on music. So once you internalize it, that's where you get your ear. You know, it's a bit like I'm able to answer questions now because I can instantaneously hear the question, understand it, and reply. If you're putting a record on, you listen to that line 30 or 40 times because it really grabs the back of your throat, you know, then, you know, you're going to be able to, you might not be able to perform it, but you'll certainly be able to understand the intent of where it's from. And then, in theory, that piece of language is yours. Just like if somebody gives me a new word today, I can kind of choose to make that mine.
There you go, I love that. Well, thanks a million for joining us here, and I have to say that was a real pleasure to listen to.
My pleasure.
So much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for tuning in to Ulster Unplugged. I'm Amanda Agnew.
And I'm Rob Lennox.
And we'll see you again.